Okay, so we're going to do a pretty quick revisit of oral reading fluency as an assessment. And the reason why we wanted to include this in the class is that some folks and some places, I think probably due to FAST being our state assessment and it being a little bit more high stakes than maybe back in the day when we were just doing dibbles, people seem to have gone a little bit off the rails with a little bit of the oral reading fluency um, purpose. So we're gonna talk through that just so that you guys are really clear on why oral reading fluency is a really good assessment, what it is, what it isn't, and why we should be using it, and how you should probably be explaining it to colleagues and parents. So let me share my screen. All right, so what we really want to do is kind of reset our thinking on curriculum-based measurement of reading, oral reading fluency, that measure in particular. So just a reminder that all districts and buildings have their own assessment system. So we all have screening assessments. Every district in the state of Iowa is using FastBridge right now. So those are things like letter sound fluency, nonsense word fluency, CBMR, rate and accuracy, and then there might be other assessments that your district or building is using as a screening measure. So that's a 3 times a year kind of quick check of who is on track and who isn't. Diagnostic then would be almost always administered one kid at a time, and it would look more at specific skills. So those are things like any kind of decoding inventory, the PASI and the PSI from 95%, which are their phonological awareness and phonics diagnostics. Really Great Reading has phonological and phonics diagnostics. There may be others that are included with your curriculum, but that really breaks down individual skills. Does the student have the skill? Does the student not? And then progress monitoring could be the same assessments used for screening. Rarely is it the same assessments used for diagnostic. They're too time consuming to use for progress monitoring most of the time. Progress monitoring would be any assessment you're using to check progress over time. So it could be the same assessment, but you could be using it a little bit differently. To me, the marker of progress monitoring is that it can be graphed and that you are graphing it, that you are setting a goal, graphing progress, and looking at rate of improvement over time. So when we're talking about oral reading fluency, CBMR, it really is answering the second question in that model that David Kilpatrick puts out that we talked about last time, which is, can the student orally read effortlessly with accuracy so that they're reading with fluency? So that's really, to answer that question, all you need to do is have a student read aloud. And oral reading fluency, CBMR, is the assessment that's been used for decades now to measure that. Why do we use it? And I think the big criticism where some things have kind of gone a little bit off the rails is that we're confusing speed with automaticity. So what really matters with oral reading fluency is automaticity. We have got to have kids that have their cognitive capacity freed up to think about what they're reading and not have to think so much about what they're decoding. So what we know is that comprehension improves when decoding is automatic. And so what we're really looking for is, has that child passed that threshold of automaticity with the level of text that we're putting in front of them? And words correct per minute, so oral reading fluency, has been shown over and over and over for truly like 25 years that it is an accurate and powerful indicator of overall reading competence. It has a very strong correlation with comprehension. The issue with comprehension assessment is very complex. I always think of it as that metaphor where like the blind people are describing an elephant. Comprehension assessment often measures one small aspect of comprehension depending on how the assessment is set up. There really isn't an awesome, simple comprehension assessment. It's very complex. It's dependent on background knowledge and vocabulary, and the student understand text structures and all that kind of stuff, plus decoding and automaticity. So if a student meets the bar or the threshold for oral reading fluency. What that tells us is that they're highly unlikely to have problems with decoding. So that's really what we're trying to check. So again, another research study from Espin and Fagan from '96, oral reading fluency correlates highly with other measures of reading proficiency, including teacher judgment, growth across grades, and performance on formal and informal measures of reading, including measures of reading comprehension. So the reason why oral reading fluency is included as the main assessment for our assessment system is because it is short and it's very telling for what an overall student's reading skills are. There's really no other assessment that's ever emerged that is so efficient at telling you quickly if a student has met that bar for decoding being a problem or not a problem. So Jan Hasbrook is kind of one of the founders of all of the sort of CBM world in school psychology and in education. And she's done some talks in the last few years that really have been trying to rein back in the original intent of oral reading fluency measures. So what she says is that oral reading fluency assessments were misnamed. She doesn't like that it's called fluency because that leads everyone to think fast. And actually, I've even heard Ted Christ is the researcher and professor out of Minnesota that created FastBridge. And I've heard him say that he wishes he had never called it FAST. FAST stands for Formative Assessment System for Teachers. It was a cute acronym, but now everyone has kind of thought, oh, we just need to have kids read fast. And that is not at all the intent from any of the researchers around these measures. So reading fluency is really a complex skill. And if you think back to the reading rope, fluency is all those strands coming together to do everything with automaticity. So that's what we're trying to get a measure of. And we know that reasonably accurate reading at an appropriate rate with suitable expression leads to accurate and deep comprehension and motivation to read. For kids that are still having trouble pulling the words off the page, their motivation to read will be much less. So we know that it serves as an indicator of overall reading proficiency, which also includes reading comprehension. A second confusion, and this one I really want you guys to pay attention to, and if you see this being misused in your schools, please call it out. There's no evidence, there's limited evidence that a higher oral reading fluency score is better. So here I'll explain it, and I think it'll make sense. So we really should think of those benchmarks for oral reading fluency as a bar. There is limited evidence that being way, 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 way above the bar, above the 50th percentile, is helpful for students. And if you really think about it, what does a student who's reading 220 words per minute aloud sound like? They do not sound great. They often are not reading with expression. They're racing. They're not pausing at punctuation. Reading too fast will affect comprehension negatively. So we don't want to stress to parents or to students that they need to beat their score, that we need to just have them go higher and higher and higher and higher, and that's better. On the other hand, there is significant evidence that students need to be above the bar. That benchmark is super important because it predicts future reading success. So if students are below the bar, they are in trouble. So that's kind of how we should think about that benchmark. But if you have, for instance, I'm going to throw a number out because I don't have the benchmarks off the top of my head. But if it's a third grader that's supposed to read 128 words per minute for winter benchmark, and they are reading 130 words per minute, and they show no problems with comprehension, and they show no problems with expression, and they sound like a great reader, that's great. If they read 124 words per minute, which is just a little bit below, but they mark all those other boxes, that might be okay. Where we really need to be careful is if they scored 172, we don't need them to score 192 the next time. So those benchmarks really are set to have, our goal should be everyone's above the bar. Not that every kid is at the 99th percentile. It is not that kind of test. So if you come across parents who misunderstand that, or colleagues that misunderstand that, every assessment for oral reading fluency in the directions never says read as fast as you can. It always says do your best reading. So that's really where we should be. If we have kids trying to speed read, we're actually basically negating the test and wasting our time. We really want to have them do their best reading and identify which students are above that bar and below that bar so that we can assign intervention appropriately, which is the purpose of all this to begin with. And remember to, and I think a lot of us know this metaphor, oral reading fluency or correct words per minute, CBMR, it's like a thermometer. It is very reliable and valid. It's a very good assessment, but it's only an indicator. It is like if you go to your doctor's office and you have a fever, they do not know what you have. They know that you're not well. So they have to do additional assessments. And that's what you'll need to do if a student is below the bar. That's when the diagnostic assessments come in, because we don't know if it's a phonological issue, if it's a phonics issue, at what level they're breaking down, what skills do they know or not know. That you cannot find that out from a 1-minute read. So one criticism sometimes, and this is legit, is that the older the kids get, the less predictive oral reading fluency is. I mean, FAST for Iowa is required K3, supported K6. You can give it to older kids. But the older the students, the less it predicts overall reading. And that just makes sense. If you think about a high school text like Beowulf or Catcher in the Rye or Shakespeare, there's a huge amount of sentence variation, regional dialect, vocabulary that actually goes into comprehending that text. You can decode all the words in some of those texts and still have difficulty comprehending. They're just much more complex. But for K-8, for sure, and for struggling readers, 9 through 12, teachers really can and should use oral reading fluency as their canary in the coal mine. That is your first indicator that things are not well with the student's reading. So I think that that's a powerful metaphor, and if you can kind of keep that in mind, that can be helpful. So for diagnostic assessment, we really think of that as more of a CT scan. So schools should have this as part of their assessment system. And I think we've come a long way with this. So if a student is in the red or not meeting benchmark or whatever, what we need to know is the answers to these questions. Which skills does a student know or not know? Which skills does a student know to mastery, which is that automaticity part? In many of the diagnostic assessments, that second bullet really comes down to, can they do it quickly? So we will often use a 2-second or a 3-second rule. If a student is asked to segment the sounds in the word street and does it like this, eat, that's automatic. If a student is asked to segment the words and the sounds in the word street and they say street, 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 and they finally get to it, that does not show automaticity. That is taking up way too much cognitive load for them to go through multiple iterations of trying to segment those sounds. That means it's not automatic. Same with the phonics assessment. You want it to show automaticity. And then that can tell us where instruction should start. We really want to be as close as possible to the actual skills that would be taught when we assess. So we're always going to err on the side of if the student's having trouble decoding, we need to know the phonological skills and the phonics skills they have or don't have. We're not going to get onto processing things and all that kind of stuff as our first go around. So almost every school should have access to an informal decoding inventory of some kind. If you don't, there's a link here, and I'll link it in the Canvas docs as well. But this is from Sharon Walpole. This is a good one, the IDI. If you don't have another one, I would suggest using this one. So they all proceed from the simplest skills, that's almost always either letter sound or CVC. So it almost always looks like this, where you're going to go from the simplest skills to the most difficult. And I would highly recommend that you always make sure you're decoding inventory includes nonsense words. Some only have nonsense words. This one has both real words followed by nonsense words. And then it goes through and gets progressively more complex. And then it goes on to even multisyllabic words at the end. And then syllable types. And it's a really good and quick way to know exactly what your student is able to do or not do with a different phonics skills. This modified scoring directions right here, this is that automaticity part. Even if your assessment doesn't include this, you can include this. You could make a mark or a circle or whatever you want to indicate that you understand that the student was able to do this skill quickly and correctly, or if they were only able to do it correctly but not quickly. So that's if they take too long or multiple attempts. So it's an important thing to differentiate whenever you're doing diagnostic assessment between that. Could they do the skill, and then could they do it with automaticity, because that will also help you in instruction. It could be that they've been taught really explicitly how to do the skill, but they've never had that it taught to automaticity.